Chapter 12, Social Psychology. My master's degree is actually in social psychology, so this is one of my favorites. Social psychology examines how people affect one another, and it looks at the power of the situation. So, as opposed to personality psychology that we just finished talking about in Chapter 11, social psychology really looks at the power of the situation over who we are as a person. Social psychologists focus on how people conceptualize and interpret situations and how these interpretations influence their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So moving over to the yellow and green boxes on the right, situationism tells us that our behavior and actions are determined by our immediate environment and surroundings. This is social psychology. We behave depending on what is going on right now at the moment. Personality psychology, on the other hand, believes in dispositionism, which tells us that our behavior and our actions are determined by internal factors, such as our personality and temperament. Now, of course, we all know it's a little bit of both, right? The way that you act is partially because of who you are and partially because of what's going on. So together they create the field called social personality psychology. But today we're really just going to be focusing on the social psychology aspect. How do other people and how does the situation or the environment affect our behavior? And one error that many people make when it comes to attributing why people do something is called the fundamental attribution error. And this is an error where people tend to assume that the behavior of another person is a trait of that person, and they underestimate the power of the situation or the state. And this error is more common in individualistic cultures like in North America. So cultures that place a bigger emphasis on the individual believe more in the trait rather than the state causes of behavior, right? So the trait is who you are, your personality traits. The state is the situation that's going on at the time. And the fundamental attribution error is the tendency to assume that people behave because of who they are on the inside rather than respecting the power of the situation. And there was a famous study in 1977 referred to as the Quizmaster study, where they randomly assigned people to be either questioners or contestants in like a game show kind of thing. And the questioners got to make up the questions themselves based on things that they knew. So obviously they knew all the answers to them, and the contestants didn't know all the answers. And at the end, they found that the contestants wrongly concluded that the questioner actually knew more than they did about the world, had more general knowledge, or were more intelligent than they were. Even though the situation is pretty obvious that the reason the questioners knew all the answers is because they came up with the questions, a lot of people completely disregarded that aspect of the situation and said, well, if they knew all the answers and I didn't know the answers, they must be smarter than me, or they must know more stuff about the world than I do. So that's one common attribution bias. So remember, attribution is deciding whether somebody is behaving a certain way because of their traits, their personality, or whether they're behaving a certain way because of the state, the situation. So another form of attribution bias is called the actor-observer bias. This is where you think that other people's behavior is caused by internal factors, while you attribute your own behavior to situational forces. So if you do poorly on your test, it's because you're not smart. But if I do poorly on my test, it's because the teacher doesn't like me. That's an actor-observer bias. I think that everything you do is based on who you are, and my behaviors are based on the situation. The self-serving bias is similar, but this one's just based on yourself, and this is the tendency to explain your success due to internal factors, your traits, and explain our failures due to external factors, the state or the situation. So if I do well on my test, it's because I'm smart. But if I do poorly on my test, it's because the teacher hates me. That's the self-serving bias. And finally, the just world bias is the belief that other people, get the outcomes that they deserve. If you did poorly on your test, you're probably not that smart, or you don't know that much about your test. If you're poor, it's because you didn't work hard. If something bad happened to you, you may have asked for it. That's the just world hypothesis, and obviously it kind of makes you a jerk if you believe in the just world hypothesis that everybody gets what they deserve and nobody's ever a victim. But there are a lot of people who fall for this and do end up victim blaming and thinking that if something bad happens to somebody, it's because they deserved it. So moving on, those are our attribution biases. Moving on to social roles. A social role is a pattern of behavior that's expected of a person in a given setting or group. If you go into class and your teacher sits down at one of the student desks in the classroom and sits there quietly and waits for things to start, you would find this weird. The social role of the teacher is to stand at the front and introduce themselves and teach. Just like if one of the students walked in and wrote their name on the board and stood at the front, everyone would find that weird. We have social roles, the way that people are supposed to act in certain situations. A social norm is the group's expectation of the appropriate or acceptable behavior for its members. Different groups, meaning different cultures or different families or different religions, different groups of people, have different standards on how to act, think, talk, dress, etc. Right? There's certain countries where if we went dressed the way that we dress here, people would stare at us and think that we looked very out of place because of social norms. A script is a person's knowledge about the sequence of events expected in a specific setting. So when you go to a restaurant, you have a script in your mind. You expect first to sit down and then be greeted, maybe have some waters, then they'll ask for your drink. If when you first walked in the door, they handed you your food before you had even sat down, you would find that strange, right? That doesn't go along with the script. So the script is the order of things. And there was another famous experiment. I love social psychology because there's a famous experiment for everything. There's a famous experiment done by Zimbardo in 1971 called the Stanford Prison Experiment. And this really demonstrated the power of social roles and social norms and scripts, what we're expecting from people in social situations. And what happened in the Stanford Prison Experiment is they randomly assigned people to either be guards or inmates. And the inmates were given the full inmate experience. They were arrested and brought in and kept in a real prison type situation. And what they found was that the guards very quickly became abusive. The prisoners very quickly started acting out. And regardless of what type of people they were to begin with, the prisoners all fell into the social role of prisoner, and the guards all fell into the social role of guard. If you're interested in that study, I believe it's Netflix. It might be HBO, but I think Netflix has a really good documentary. It's one of those like reenactment kind of documentaries that lets you see what happened in the experiment. You could always read the article too. All right, on to one of my very favorite topics that I even wrote my master's thesis about, cognitive dissonance. To understand cognitive dissonance, first we need to remember what attitude means. Our attitude is our evaluation of a person or an idea or an object. Basically, what you always think of as attitude, your opinion, your feelings on something, okay? And cognitive dissonance is the psychological discomfort that happens when you have two or more inconsistent attitudes or inconsistent thoughts or behaviors. Even if your behavior is inconsistent with your thoughts, you'll experience cognitive dissonance. For example, if you think it's just terrible to be late, and being late is the rudest, most horrible thing that you could ever do, but you're late all the time, you'll probably experience cognitive dissonance. You're going to feel yucky every time you're late or every time you even think about being late, because in your mind, being late is a really terrible thing to do, and you're doing it all the time. So you would experience cognitive dissonance. There's lots of examples of cognitive dissonance. The book talks about smoking. On the next slide, I have a few more examples. But first, let's read a bit more about the definition. The theory of cognitive dissonance states that when we experience a conflict in our behaviors or attitudes or beliefs, that runs counter to our positive self-perceptions, we experience psychological discomfort or dissonance, right? So when we do something or think something or feel something that goes against our normal positive thoughts, we experience discomfort. It doesn't feel good. And when we experience cognitive dissonance, we're motivated to decrease it because it's psychologically and even physically and mentally uncomfortable. It can even cause physical symptoms to experience cognitive dissonance. So we try to reduce it. And there's 3 ways you can reduce cognitive dissonance. One is to change the behavior. So if I'm very much against being late and I'm always running late and that makes me feel yucky, I could change my discrepant behavior. I could stop being late, set my alarm earlier, or figure out a new schedule and not be late anymore. Something else I could do is change my cognitions through rationalization or denial. So I could change how I'm thinking by rationalizing it, saying, well, being late is bad, but for me it's not so bad because I have kids and my schedule doesn't permit, and I would rationalize or deny that what I'm doing is wrong. So being late is still bad, but mine is different. And then the third is to add a new cognition, right? You can add a whole new thing saying, it's okay to be late if you have children. Or it's okay to be late as long as you're not more than 20 minutes late. Or it's okay to be late as long as people expect it from you. You add a new thought or cognition, which decreases the discomfort and allows you to continue that behavior, in this case of being late. Under the picture of Nick Jonas, I forget the name of that movie, but it's a fraternity movie, and this part has an initiation, and under the picture it says, a difficult initiation into a group influences us to like the group more. So let's think about that for a minute before I move on to the next slide that talks more about this. Why would a difficult initiation, a tough initiation process to get into a group, why would that make you like the group more? Let's think about that. You're putting a lot of effort into joining this group. So if in your mind you think the group is not very important or not very good, right? I could take this group or leave it. Maybe the people are kind of dumb. I'm not that into it. That's going to cause cognitive dissonance because you've put a lot of effort into joining this group. Your behaviors say the group is important, and your brain tells you the group is not important, and that's cognitive dissonance. If it was real easy to get in, then you can tell yourself that the group kind of sucks, and you won't experience cognitive dissonance because little effort matches with little value of the group. So groups that require a difficult initiation cause people to put a lot of effort into joining that group, and then they change their cognitions to match that effort so they don't experience cognitive dissonance. They tell themselves, this group is so super amazing, it's the best group in the whole world, because then it totally warrants all of the effort that they put into getting into the group. I hope that makes sense. We can look at the graph, the bar graph on the bottom left. It shows that a study was actually done all the way back in 1959 and had participants either undergo no initiation at all to join a group, or an easy initiation, or a difficult initiation. And then afterwards they asked them how much they liked the group, and as you can see in the bar graph, the harder the initiation, the more they liked the group. That makes sense with cognitive dissonance. Up on the top left, it talks about another study from 2006 that found that courses that were associated with the highest level of effort were evaluated as being more valuable. So if you take several different classes in college, the one that you have to put the most effort into, at the end you'll probably say it was the most valuable. Furthermore, students indicated that they learned more in courses that required more effort, regardless of the grades they received in those courses. So just having to put in more effort makes you think that you learned more. That's so you don't experience cognitive dissonance. Otherwise, you would feel silly for having put in all that effort if it wasn't very important, just like the initiations. Over on the right, you can see the title page from my master's thesis. That's my maiden name on the bottom. You may have noticed it in my email address. My thesis actually studied playing hard to get. And part of my thesis really focused on cognitive dissonance. If you're interested in reading it, it's 76 pages, but you're more than welcome. I could send it to you. Or I could screenshot the part about cognitive dissonance, I suppose. But the reason that I found in my thesis that attractive people who played hard to get got more attention is that their playing hard to get made the people who thought that they were dating them online, they had to put more effort into the people who were playing hard to get. And when they put all that extra effort into it, they rated that person higher. They figured the person must be good if I put all of this effort. If they put a lot of effort into chasing somebody to try and date them, and they thought that that person wasn't really very good to begin with, they would experience cognitive dissonance. So they would elevate how attractive they thought the person was if they had to put a lot of effort into getting together with them. Again, if you want to read the whole paper, you can. But playing hard to get, just like initiations, are related to cognitive dissonance, which, as we just learned, is the discomfort you experience when your behaviors don't match your thoughts or your cognitions, or when two different thoughts or cognitions don't match. Moving on to persuasion. As you may know from the common definition of persuasion, persuasion means that you're changing somebody's attitude towards something. So using some sort of communication to change somebody's attitude, to persuade them to think the way you do. The Yale attitude change approach actually describes the conditions under which people tend to change their attitudes. So this is very useful for marketing and other things because they talk about the exact source and type of message and type of audience that go together to create the most change. And this was started by a guy named Carl Hovland, who during World War II extensively researched persuasion for the US Army. They needed people to join the army, so he was researching persuasion. How would they persuade people to enlist? After he worked for the army, he continued his exploration of persuasion at Yale University, and he's the guy who came up with the Yale attitude change approach. If you want more details, your book does explain it. The foot in the door technique is another marketing technique as well, but it can be used for other things. And this is where the persuader gets a person to agree to bestow a small favor or buy a small item, only to later request something larger. So teenagers use this a lot. Can I stay out to 9 o'clock? Sure. How about 9:30? Okay, fine. What if I just stay out until 10? You might even call it pushing your luck, right? But you just keep pushing further and further rather than just starting straight up. Can I stay out till midnight? They push it a little bit at a time. That's called the foot in the door technique. Over on the right side, we have a picture depicting the elaboration likelihood model. The elaboration likelihood model tells you if you're going to persuade someone, depending on the type of audience, you'll either want to use the central route or the peripheral route. The central route is for people who are willing to hear you out and listen to you, and it's based on rationality and logic. You tell somebody a reason that they should change their mind, right? I think you should buy this car because it has good gas mileage and it's not very expensive and you can fit your whole family in it. Those are real good reasons to buy the car. That's the central route, and it will create lasting change. I can convince the person that this car is the best one, and they'll stick with that. The peripheral route, on the other hand, doesn't go through the logical models because it reaches audiences who aren't really listening or aren't willing to change, and you almost kind of have to trick them into changing. So you put something attractive, you attach something attractive to the thing that you want them to like, right? Or you could put something unattractive to something you don't want them to like. So in the car example, they might have a fancy commercial that makes it look all shiny and exciting and adventurous, or put a famous person driving the car. That would be a peripheral route. And peripheral routes result in temporary change. You can change somebody's attitude short term. And in the example, the picture, the 2 for $5 Big Mac goes the central route by telling you, look how much food for this cheap price. This is what it's called. Come and get it. That'll cause lasting change. I may keep buying Big Macs. The Carl's Jr. ad on the right side has a pretty girl eating the sandwich. Presumably, they're hoping that people who aren't willing to hear you out about price and ingredients and all that are going to say, "Ooh, pretty girl, that sandwich looks great. I'll go get one." They may not continue to eat Carl's Jr. burgers forever, but it temporarily changed their attitude into thinking that they like this thing. So that's the elaboration likelihood model. Onto conformity. This one has another famous experiment done by Solomon Asch. Conformity is a change in a person's behavior that to go along with the group, even if they don't agree with the group. You conform with the group because you just want to fit in or want them to like you. So the Asch effect is referred to as the influence of the group majority on an individual's judgment. And the reason that it's called that is that Solomon Asch conducted the famous study on conformity, excuse me, where he had several confederates. Confederates means that they were in on it. They worked for him and knew what was going on. And one participant who didn't know what was going on. And they were all told to say which line was the same line as the one on the left. And as you can see in the little picture, it's pretty clear that line B is the same size as the one on the left. But when all the other people in the group, who that participant, he thought that everybody was a participant like him, when they all said, "Oh, it's definitely A, it's A, it's A, it's A," often the participants would say, "Oh yeah, it's A." They wanted to conform. They wanted to fit in. They thought everyone was going to laugh at them if they said it was B because they were all so sure that it was A. So this is called the Asch effect, the influence of the group majority on an individual's judgment. Normative social influence tells us that people conform to the group norm to fit in, to feel good, and to be accepted by the group. So that's why you do it. You conform to other people to fit in, to feel good, and to be accepted. And the informational social influence is that people conform because they believe the group is competent and have the correct information. So there's two different types of social influences. Normative social influence, where you are influenced because you want to fit in or be liked, and informational social influence, where you don't know the answer, so you listen to everybody else. Now, in Asch's experiment, we know it has to be the normative one because it's kind of obvious which line it is. If it was a difficult question that people didn't know the answer to, they might be conforming due to informational social influence. But because it's an easy question that we very much do know the answer to, the reason for conformity would be the normative social influence, to not be mocked or ridiculed for disagreeing with everybody. Now, this research has been replicated many times, and research does suggest that since Asch's research, I don't have the date on here, I believe it was in the 60s, I checked that, but it's been many decades, and since then, conformity may have gone down since that time. They're thinking that the rates may have gone down, people are becoming more individual thinkers, and efforts to replicate Asch's study have made it clear that many factors determine how likely it is someone will demonstrate conformity to the group. So depending on your age, gender, and sociocultural background, you may be more or less likely to conform. I believe, based on the fact that it was a long time ago, his participants were probably mostly or all white males. So maybe they're the most likely to conform. We can look up details if you're interested. On to one of my favorites, obedience. This study always blows me away. Maybe I'll post a video or something. There's no video of the actual study, I don't think, but there's lots of reenactments. Milgram's study was nuts. First, let's define obedience. Obedience is the change of an individual's behavior to comply with a demand by an authority figure. So I change the way I act because somebody in charge told me to. Right? Your dog goes to obedience school because you're in charge, and when you say something, your dog needs to obey. Your dog needs to change its behavior and stop standing and start sitting because you said sit. That's obedience. People often comply with the request because they're concerned about a consequence if they don't comply. Right? If your teacher tells you, "Can you go sit up in the front now?" you're scared to not listen to your teacher because they're an authority figure. They have some power over you, and you're worried about what might happen if you don't listen to them, even if to you it doesn't make any sense that you should change seats. So Stanley Milgram was a social psychology professor at Yale, and he was influenced by the trial, a court trial, of a man named Adolf Eichmann, who was a Nazi war criminal. And he was in the US and had been found to be a Nazi and take part in killing many people during the Holocaust. And he went to court to decide if he was going to be found guilty for these murders. And he said, well, I was just doing what I was told. And Stanley Milgram was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You just killed dozens of people because somebody told you to? Like, just because they told you to? So he decided to study this and study obedience and say, will somebody do something harmful just because you tell them to? And turns out they will. The study that Stanley Milgram put together had a real test subject come in thinking that they were teaching another test subject a list of words and definitions. But really the person who they thought they were teaching was in on this as well. And they couldn't see them. And they were told that every time the person made a mistake on these words, they should give them an electric shock. And the more mistakes they made, the stronger the shock got. Now remember, our participant can't see the person that they're shocking. And in fact, they weren't actually shocking them. They just thought they were shocking them. But they couldn't see them. They would administer the shock, and they would hear the person screaming and yelling, ow, that hurts. And they would ask them another question, and they would make another mistake, and they would shock them again, and they would scream, and they would beg them to stop. But the experimenter, who was in charge of this whole thing, who realistically didn't even have any authority over anybody, but he was in charge of what was going on at the moment, he kept telling the person, keep shocking them, keep shocking them. It's okay, it's what you're supposed to do, keep shocking them. And astoundingly, they just kept shocking them. These people were screaming out in pain and begging them to stop. And the participants were not stopping because the experimenter, who had this fake kind of authority over them, kept telling them that they should keep doing it. And in fact, 2 out of 3, 65% of the participants continued to administer shocks to an unresponsive learner. When the person on the other side of that wall, who had been screaming and yelling in pain, stopped responding, like they had passed out or died, 2/3 of people still kept shocking them because the experimenter told them to. So Stanley Milgram found that people will really go to astounding lengths just because somebody tells them to, somebody in a position of authority. And remember, in this situation, it wasn't even really a parent or a teacher or a police officer or anything like that. It was just the guy running the experiment. And these people were shocking, or thought that they were shocking people. Anyway, I find this totally mind-blowing, and the reason that it hasn't been replicated is that it's not ethical. This study is often brought up in a discussion of research ethics because it's not ethical to put somebody under the duress of thinking that they are possibly killing somebody and somebody is telling them, keep doing it, keep doing it. Anyhow, that's obedience. We will move on to how groups work. I hope you enjoyed all the different research studies related to obedience and conformity and cognitive dissonance. This is a fun one with lots of experiments. But on this slide, we're just going to learn some definitions about groups. Groupthink is the modification of the opinions of members of a group to align with what they believe is the group consensus. So you change your opinion to match everybody in the group. If everybody else thinks the same except you change your mind to agree with them. That's groupthink. In group situations, the group often takes action that individuals would not perform outside the group setting because groups make more extreme decisions than individuals do. Oftentimes, a group of people will make a decision so extreme that none of those individuals would have made that decision on their own. This is caused by de-individuation, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's down at the bottom. First, let's learn group polarization. That's the strengthening of an original group attitude after the discussion of views within a group. So when everybody in the group is for something and they sit and talk about it, at the end, they're even more for it. Or if everybody in the group is against something, when they sit around and talk about it, they all become more against it. right? I'm sure you can imagine that. Everybody sits around saying, oh, I don't like her. She drives me crazy. She's so annoying. And at the end of it, everybody hates her, right? That's group polarization. Social loafing is a reduction in individual output on tasks where contributions are pooled. That's a fancy way of saying the guy who doesn't do any work in the group project. He's the loaf, the social loafer. And the likelihood of social loafing in student work groups increases as the size of the group increases. So if we're just 2 or 3 of us working on a group, it's unlikely someone's going to bail and not do anything. If there's 12 of us in the group, we'll likely have at least one loafer, if not several social loafers, just loafing around, not doing anything while the rest of the people do the work. And social loafing, as well as the groups making extreme decisions, are caused by de-individuation, which tells us that situations in which a person may feel a sense of anonymity and therefore a reduction in accountability and sense of self when among others. So that's when you're with other people, you feel more anonymous, you feel less accountable, you feel less like you need to worry about your sense of self, and you just go along with the group, or you don't worry about it. And that's why people would social loaf, or that's why people would make extreme decisions as a group and not by themselves. We're almost done, I promise. Prejudice and discrimination are different. Prejudice is a negative attitude or feeling towards an individual based solely on their membership in the particular group. So prejudice is a feeling or an attitude. Prejudice is common against people who are members of an unfamiliar cultural group. So when somebody is an outsider, often they'll experience prejudice. Stereotype is a specific belief or assumption about individuals based on their membership in the group. So prejudice is an attitude or a feeling, like, ugh, I don't like them. Stereotype is a specific belief, like those people are smart, or those people are loud, or those people are lazy. That would be a stereotype, as opposed to a prejudice is, I don't like them, bad, yuck, or yes, I do like them, happy, good. So prejudice is feelings or attitudes. Stereotypes is an actual specific belief or assumption about the people based solely on their membership of the group. And then discrimination is an actual behavior, a negative action towards somebody based on their membership of a particular group. So again, stereotype is a thought about people, just like prejudice is a attitude about people, and then discrimination is the actual action. I chose, rather than putting the book's definition of racism, to use the Merriam-Webster definition of racism. It's a little bit long, but I will read it to you. There are 2 definitions in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Racism, a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. That's one definition, believing that race is important in determining our traits and that one race is better than another. Also, behavior or attitudes that reflect and foster this belief, such as racial discrimination or prejudice, like we just talked about. A second definition is the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. A political or social system founded on racism and designed to execute its principles. Now, this one is demonstrated in the statistics over on the right side, which shows us that Black people are disproportionately stopped by the police and Black people are disproportionately sentenced in the United States. This is because of the second definition, the systemic oppression of a racial group. Systemic means it's part of the system, part of the way that the city or the state or the country works. And I'm sure you're familiar with these types of statistics. Feel free to pause and take a little look at them. But as you can see, racism can be defined as the belief that race determines who we are and that one race is better than the other. And racism can also be the systemic oppression of a racial group through government forces or through the masses, or a political or a social system, right? Other types of prejudice and discrimination include sexism, which is prejudice and discrimination towards individuals based on their sex. Typically, sexism takes the form of men holding biases against women, but of course, there are exceptions. Ageism is prejudice and discrimination toward individuals based solely on their age. Typically, ageism occurs against older adults, but it can occur toward younger adults. Homophobia is prejudice and discrimination of individuals based on their sexual orientation. Now I'll pause from reading these to move over to the right side now that I mentioned homophobia, because I find this study very interesting, although it was about 25 years ago. This is another sex research study where they had groups of men come in and watch pornography clips. And they actually measured the men's arousal. And they found that they had given them a survey a while back to find out who was homophobic and who wasn't. And they found that while both groups were aroused by the heterosexual or straight pornography, and both groups were actually aroused by the lesbian pornography, only the homophobic group was aroused by the homosexual pornography. So the theory here, or the discussion because of these results, is that perhaps people are homophobic because they actually are gay or have gay tendencies themselves. That's what it would seem like from this data, at least. Your book describes the research a little bit better, I believe. Let me know if you'd like more information on this one. Back over to our definitions on the left. Prejudice and discrimination persist in society because of social learning and because of conformity to social norms. These are two reasons that these things continue to go on. An in-group is a group that we identify with or see ourselves belonging to, whereas the out-group is the group that we don't belong to, or we view as fundamentally different from us. And of course, we exhibit prejudice or discrimination against people in our out-group. Research suggests that anything that can allow individuals to work together toward common goals can decrease prejudicial attitudes. Those are just some takeaways from that section of your book. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. What is a self-fulfilling prophecy? A self-fulfilling prophecy is an expectation held by a person that alters his or her behavior in a way that tends to make it true. So it's self-fulfilling. You're changing the way you act to make your beliefs come true. Sorry, I needed a sip of water. So in the picture, the boy is sitting in the corner, and what's happening here is the teacher thinks that he's a naughty boy, and she makes him sit over in the corner, and then he feels sad and embarrassed and bored and lonely, so he starts to act out. So the teacher punishes him some more, and the cycle continues, right? The same thing would happen if you start putting a disproportionate number of Black people in jail. When you're in jail, you get into more trouble, you meet bad people, you have less of a chance of getting a job afterwards. There's all these things that happen by being put into jail that could make you take a wrong turn later down the road or have poor behavior later down the road. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Somebody does something that makes what they thought was true come true, right? The cops are saying, well, Black people are criminals, so then they lock the Black people up and then they turn them into criminals, and then they're like, see, they're criminals, right? Same thing, he's a bad boy, he's not behaving in class, so I go sit him in the corner even before he's done anything wrong, but now that he's sitting in the corner, he's going to act out. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And research by Rosenthal and Jacobson, some more research, found that disadvantaged students whose teachers expected them to perform well had higher grades than disadvantaged students whose teachers expected them to do poorly, right? So they're all coming in as disadvantaged students, but the ones whose teachers thought the kids were going to do well, they did better than those whose teachers didn't think they were going to do well. Self-fulfilling prophecy. And confirmation bias is where we seek out information that supports our stereotypes and ignore the information that's inconsistent with our stereotypes. Maybe I say, boys are way more wild than girls. The boys are hard to control in my classroom. And I happen to notice the boys who are acting out while not noticing the girls who are acting out. I'm confirming my bias. I don't pay attention to the girls when they misbehave, but I pay lots of attention to the boys misbehaving. I talk about it more. I focus on it more. That's a confirmation bias, seeking out the information that supports our stereotypes. People do this all the time using Google, right? If I'm trying to prove my point in an argument and I Google my side of the argument, I'm going to get things that agree with me, right? On to aggression. I promise we're almost done. Hostile aggression is motivated by feelings of anger with intent to cause pain, whereas instrumental aggression is motivated by achieving a goal and does not necessarily involve intent to cause pain. So hostile aggression is basically when you're mad, and instrumental aggression is when you want something. Bullying is repeated negative treatment of another person over time. I try and remind my kids of this, that bullying doesn't mean somebody was mean to you once. Bullying means that it's happening over time. It's happening repeatedly. Some facts about bullying. Children who are emotionally reactive, right, they're more emotional, are at a greater risk for being bullied. Children who are different from others are likely to be targeted for bullying, different in any way. And LGBTQ teens are at a very high risk of being bullied and hurt due to their sexual orientation. There's some statistics on the bottom of how many teens. 25% of teens have been targets of cyberbullying, possibly even more, just 25% who are willing to admit to it. And 2/3 of teens have witnessed cruel behavior online, where only 10% of parents know about this. So talk to your parents if you are experiencing cyberbullying or any kind of bullying, or even if you've just witnessed it. It's always a good idea to talk to your parents or an adult that you trust. You can pause if you'd like to look at the other statistics, but I'm going to move on. The bystander effect is when a witness or a bystander does not volunteer to help a victim or a person in distress. This happens because of the diffusion of responsibility, which is the tendency for no one in a group to help because the responsibility to help is spread throughout the group. So everybody thinks somebody else is going to help and then nobody helps. This became a famous term after the case of Kitty Genovese, where 37 people watched her murder. She was murdered in the courtyard of a townhouse, and everybody watched out their windows and nobody called the police. It actually turns out they've found out more details later on, and some people did intervene, and in the end they helped the police find the murderer, but nobody actually called the police. And I remembered this when I was taking a road trip in my teens and I saw a horrible car accident, and my friends who were in the car with me said, "Oh, I'm sure somebody else called the police." And I said, "You know what, let's just call," because 37 people watched this lady get murdered and nobody called the police. We don't want to be one of those people. Let's just call the police. And it turns out that 2 or 3 people had already called in the accident, but I'm still glad that I did, because you wouldn't want to be part of the bystander effect and have somebody not get the help that they need because everybody thinks somebody else is going to help them. So that's bystander effect. Pro-social behavior is voluntary behavior with intent to help other people. Basically doing good, nice things. Pro-social behavior, helping others. Altruism is a desire to help others even if the costs outweigh the benefits of helping. So you're basically just a good person. Even if it's going to cost you more to help somebody else, you still do it anyway to help them. And if you watch Friends, you'll remember when Joey and Phoebe were arguing about whether a real selfless good deed exists. And Joey's saying that even when you do something good, feeling good about it, feeling like a good person, watching the other person smile or be happy or getting their thanks or praise is part of the benefit of helping, and that the costs don't outweigh the benefit if you include the benefit of feeling good about yourself. It's an interesting argument. Empathy is the capacity to understand another person's perspective, right? If I empathize, I can feel what you feel or understand your point of view. And people with greater amounts of empathy exhibit greater amounts of altruism, which makes sense. And it actually supports Joey's theory that if you are more empathetic and can feel what the other person feels more, you would be more rewarded by doing something good for them. Last slide before the summary, attraction. Proximity tells us that you're more likely to be friends with people or have relationships with people who you have regular contact with. Homophily tells us that people have a tendency to form social networks, including friendships, marriage, business relationships, and other relationships with people who are similar. So we're more likely to make relationships with people who we spend time with, have regular contact with, as well as people who are similar. There is no research supporting that opposites attract. We're actually attracted to people who are like us. Reciprocity is the give and take in the relationships. We're more likely to like and engage with people who like us back and who do things back for us. Sternberg's theories of love is over here on the right side. Sternberg talks about intimacy, passion, and commitment. Intimacy is the sharing of details and intimate thoughts and emotions. You could have a close friendship with intimacy. Passion is the physical attraction, the flame and the fire, right? Somebody who you date or hook up with, but you're not really in love with. That has passion. Commitment is standing by a person, the in sickness and in health part of the relationship. That can also be in a friendship or in a relationship. And if you look over at the triangle, you'll see that the one that has everything, the best kind of love that's going to get you through your whole life together, is called consummate love. That one has all three: intimacy, passion, and commitment. But if you look over on the sides and in the corners, let's look first at the corner that says passion. A relationship with only passion is called infatuation. Up in the yellow, a relationship with only intimacy is called liking, like a friendship. Relationship with only commitment is called empty love. Commitment alone. You don't even like the person. You don't have any attraction to them. You're just committed to them. Kind of pointless. Empty love. Then some of the types of love have two. So on the left side, we see romantic love has both intimacy and passion, but no commitment. Companionate love has intimacy and commitment, but no passion. And fatuous love has passion and commitment, but no intimacy. And you can read more about this in your book. I really like this theory, and in fact, Elaine Hatfield really likes this theory too. Last one is social exchange theory. We act as naive economists in keeping a tally of the ratio of costs and benefits of forming and maintaining a relationship to others. So we kind of balance out and see, is it worth keeping these relationships or not? All right, summary time. Feel free to turn it off if you don't feel like listening to the summary. I'm going to go nice and quick. Social psychology is the field of psychology that examines how people impact or affect each other with particular focus on the power of the situation. Situationism tells us that our behavior and actions are determined by our immediate environment and surroundings. That's what social psychologists think about. Dispositionism tells us our behavior and actions are determined by internal factors such as personality and temperament. That's what personality psychologists tell us. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overemphasize internal factors as attributions for behavior and underestimate the power of the situation. The actor-observer bias is where we attribute other people's behavior to their personality while attributing our own behavior to the situation. The self-serving bias is when we explain our successes due to who we are and our failures due to the situation. And the just world hypothesis is the victim blaming, they get what they deserve. A social role is a pattern of behavior that's expected of a person in a given setting or group, right? How you expect your teacher to act, or, you might be weirded out if when the waiter walked up to your table, he sat down on the ground. That wouldn't fit his social role. The social norm is the group's expectation of appropriate or acceptable behavior for its members of that specific group. A script is a person's knowledge about the sequence of events expected in a specific setting. The Stanford Prison Experiment demonstrated the power of these things, social roles, norms, and scripts, by randomly assigning people to either be prisoners or guards, and we saw how quickly they adapted to their roles and became their roles. An attitude is our evaluation of a person, an idea, or an object. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort that occurs when two or more inconsistent attitudes, behaviors, or cognitions happen. It's when your behaviors don't match your thoughts that you don't feel good. You can reduce cognitive dissonance by changing the behavior, by changing your cognitions, or by adding a new cognition. Persuasion is the process of changing our attitudes towards something based on some type of communication. The Yale Attitude Change Approach studies persuasion and describes the conditions under which people tend to change their attitudes. Over to the right side, conformity is a change in a person's behavior to go along with the group, even if they don't agree with the group. The Ash effect is the influence of the group majority on the individual's judgment, based on Solomon Ash's famous conformity experiment. Remember the different lines, how long they were? Normative social influence is when you conform to fit in or feel good or be accepted. Informational social influence is when you conform because you don't know the answer and you think the group does. Obedience is when you change your behavior to please an authority figure. Remember, that was the Milgram experiment. They were shocking people just because someone told them to. The reason they studied that was that they were curious why the Nazis were willing to just kill people because somebody told them to. Group polarization is the strengthening of the original group attitude after discussing views within the group. So remember, if a group of people like something and they talk about it, when they're done, they'll like it even more. Same if they don't like it. Group think is when group members modify their opinions to match what they believe is the group consensus. That's very similar to that Ash effect, right? Social loafing is the guy in the group who doesn't do any work, right? Exertion of less effort by a person working in a group. Prejudice is a negative attitude or feeling toward an individual based on their membership of a group. A stereotype is a specific belief or assumption about somebody based on their membership of a group. Discrimination is an actual action toward an individual as a result of their membership in a group. Racism, the book defines as prejudice and discrimination based solely on race. Of course, we went deeper into that definition on the slide about racism. Hostile aggression is when you exhibit aggression because of feelings of anger and you want to harm the person. Instrumental aggression is motivated by achieving the goal and doesn't necessarily involve wanting to cause pain. Bullying is repeated negative treatment of another person over time. The bystander effect is when the witness does not volunteer to help or does not even call the police when somebody needs help, and this is because they think somebody else will. The diffusion of responsibility, the tendency for no one in a group to help because the responsibility is spread throughout the group. Pro-social behavior is voluntary behavior with the intent of helping somebody. Altruism is a desire to help others even when the costs outweigh the benefits. Empathy is the capacity to understand another person's perspective or feel what he or she feels. Proximity tells us you're more likely to be friends with people you have regular contact with. Homophily says we're more likely to form relationships with people we're similar to. Reciprocity is the give and take of our relationships. We're more likely to engage with people who like us back. And social exchange theory tells us that we weigh out the costs and benefits of all of our relationships, and we put effort into those with more benefits than costs. I didn't talk about Sternberg's love theory in the summary slide, but you do need to know that one as well. I just ran out of space. It is right before this slide.